Welcome to Mano, U.S. Puerto Rico, Journey Toward a More Perfect Union.
A podcast amplifying the voices of leaders, thinkers, activists, and allies from across the political spectrum who support Puerto Rico's fight for full democracy and self-determination.
I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martin Rivera, Director of Advocacy.
On today's episode, we'll kick off by discussing Puerto Rico's long road to recovery following the debt crisis, the devastating effect of natural disasters, and political turmoil.
Specifically, how the island's territorial status perpetuates the detrimental treatment of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, which has led to a mass exodus to the U.S. mainland since the turn of the century.
We'll also shine a light on Puerto Rico's recent strides towards stability and prosperity, and how this is attracting some Puerto Ricans to move back to the island with the hope of building a brighter future for themselves and the communities they care so much about.
What we like to call El Comeback. As Puerto Rico works to chart its own path towards progress, many stateside Puerto Ricans are drawn back to the island, eager to contribute to its resilience and resurgence.
Yet, lingering uncertainty stemming from Puerto Rico's territorial status poses a dilemma for many, especially young professionals. Many of us find ourselves torn between wanting to go back to the island or staying stateside to be able to achieve our maximum potential in our careers, education, and standard of living for ourselves and our families.
The vision for Puerto Rico is to be together with the U.S. and have a strong partnership in development and careers and education. We want to be able to contribute, but we want to contribute from our home.
Later in the show, we'll be joined by a strong social entrepreneur and philanthropist, Angelique Sina. Angelique is the president and founder of Friends of Puerto Rico and the executive director of the Metro Women's Business Center. She joins us to discuss a comeback while offering insights into her personal journey and work in accelerating economic opportunities for the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico.
So let's get started. All right, Mano listeners, you know the deal. Let's kick off with news and updates, followed by our conversation on El Comeback. Martin, couldn't you give us a quick update on what's happening in Congress, the Puerto Rico Status Act, and other recent news?
Well, right now in Congress, the biggest news this week is trying to finish government funding for fiscal year 2024. Again, we're 5 months into the fiscal year, and we've only completed half of funding the government for 2024. Luckily, recent news just broke that there's a compromise between all sides of leadership in Congress. They're going to try to see if they can pass this bill, which is the last 6 appropriations bills to fund the government, which includes defense, homeland security, labor, HHS, legislative branch, financial services, and state and foreign ops. So a bunch of different national security issues as well as healthcare issues that obviously quickly impact the island. But again, the deadline's this Friday. Fingers crossed. I am hopeful that they'll get it through the finish line. And hopefully, even if there is a short government shutdown that lingers towards Saturday, I do believe the government will be funded. So that's the major news coming out of Congress in D.C. When it comes to the Puerto Rico Status Act, we continue to gain more co-sponsors. In the House, we gain an additional co-sponsor, bringing the total to 94 bipartisan co-sponsors, while in the Senate, 23 co-sponsors. Once you include the lead sponsor of the bill, that's basically a quarter of the Senate in support of the Puerto Rico Status Act. Again, when it comes to this issue, the most important thing I can mention to our viewers is that this is the time for you to speak your voice, contact your legislators, and tell them the importance of resolving this issue once and for all after 125 years of Puerto Rico being a U.S. territory, and to advance the Puerto Rico Status Act towards a hearing so we can finally address some of the outstanding issues to finally resolve this issue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, getting supporters to reach out to Congress and ask them to co-sponsor the bill and to hold hearings on it, both in the House and the Senate, that's incredibly important. Now, Martin, could you tell us a little bit about what's been happening on the island? Because we've heard some news that, there's been some trips to the island, there's some additional visits that are forthcoming, and that all of this is actually tied into the bigger picture of what's happening in the 2024 general elections nationally.
Well, Puerto Rico had a big visit from both sides of the aisle, from Congress. Both Republican and Democrat members of Congress went to Puerto Rico this week, and CAC Bold PAC, which is mainly made up of Democrats, went, as well as another PAC entirely of Republicans going to Puerto Rico. They met with actual officials from the island, with the governor, even some candidates running for office, and they also did site visits at important facilities such as some of the plants, some of the solar farms that we have. What that shows to me is the interest in Congress in as to the needs of Puerto Rico, being that it is an election year, being that there are more Puerto Rican stateside than there are in Puerto Rico. They know the importance of addressing the needs of the people on the island so they can address the concerns of their own constituents.
That makes sense.
Additionally, this weekend, First Lady Joe Biden also went to Fort Buchanan, and she went there to speak about her Joining Forces initiative, which is an initiative to support military families on the island. It shows how this administration is also taking an eye into Puerto Rico and trying to address some of the overlooked necessities of some of our veterans that have given so much for the service of this country, but cannot vote for their actual president. So that was something that was critical. And at the same time, I find this to be coincidental that it's at the same time that President Biden is launching his Latinos con Biden and Harris initiative for 2024, and also leading to the vice president actually going to Puerto Rico this upcoming Friday. So it does show that, at least on the federal side, that the interest of the needs of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico is increasing, not just from the Congress and the legislative branch, but also from the executive branch.
And all of this is inevitably tied to the efforts to make sure that in 2024, voters of Puerto Rican descent that live stateside participate, go out to vote, and know that their members of Congress and the federal executive is paying attention to the needs of the fellow citizens on the island, which in many cases are their family and their friends. So I think that that's really indicative of the importance that Puerto Rico is gaining nationally. And it provides me a sense of hope that the issues that are related to Puerto Rico that are happening on the island are also trickling into the awareness of the elected leadership and the candidates that are going to be making the decisions, not just for the remainder of this year, but going into next session of Congress and the next presidential administration.
Additionally, one other thing that happened in the last few weeks is that we finally got some, I would say, reliable public polling on the island as to the current races going on for resident commissioner, for governor, and for San Juan mayor. Polling was done by Nuevo Dia, which I found interesting that overall it shows that for the general election, the candidates running in favor of statehood are winning each race, every single race, which also kind of links to a recent race that happened this weekend for the Puerto Rico Democratic Party, where a statehooder, Luis Davila Pernas, actually won the presidency for the Democratic Party of Puerto Rico, which shows that the support for statehood is crossing party lines, both Democrat and Republican, and that the interest is not just increasing in Puerto Rico to finally resolve this issue and actually having the tools to actually achieve this goal, but also the interest is, as I mentioned, it's coming from the federal level. And when you have those joined together, that's when actually progress can actually occur. And that's why I'm hopeful.
No, definitely. I think one of the things that's interesting to highlight is that if we break down the polling by El Nuevo Dia newspaper a little bit more, one of the things that we see is that the two front runners for the governorship in Puerto Rico are actually both from the pro-statehood party. Mm-hmm. So it is the current governor, Pedro Pierluisi, who's a Democrat, and our resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, who's a Republican. In the polling that was done, if either one of them wins the primary, they would win the general election. Yeah. Now, what's interesting is Jennifer Gonzalez seems to be polling a little bit behind the governor for the primary, but then ends up polling better than him for the potential general election.
So it's interesting, the politics going forward. Obviously, the good news is that regardless who actually wins the primary on June 2nd, they both have favorable outcomes going forward. But it is true. The resident commissioner does have slightly more favorability and can probably go across, gain support from across party lines on the island from the local parties. But again, the good news is, regardless of whichever candidate it is, the issue of statehood, it shows that it has majority of support as to who the people of Puerto Rico want to choose as their future leader.
Yeah.
one other like critical point is that the second party, not to get too political, which is the Partido Popular, I've noticed that they actually started losing support. And in most of these pollings, they actually didn't come in second, which they've been the second largest party in Puerto Rico. They actually started coming in third in a lot of these races, which shows to me that again, they have to revamp their strategy and their agenda and their policy portfolio. But given that they're still, I will say, kind of stuck in the past, that they are losing what support they had. And you see a lot of their support, which a lot of populares have always said that, we want to stay the same, but they've had more lenience towards the independence movement. And you see the
erosion in their
erosion
base. Yeah.
and that base actually going a little bit towards the Independence Party from the Partido Popular. The statehood party is also gaining some of those votes. But right now, that's the critical thing that I noticed, that all the traditional major parties in Puerto Rico, they've actually gone down to third place when it comes to the favorability as to how Puerto Rico's voters are going to cast their ballot on this upcoming election.
Yeah, and I think that's very significant because what it indicates is that the highest likelihood is that Puerto Rico, come 2025, will have a pro-statehood governor, be that Pedro Pierluisi or Jennifer Gonzalez. It will more likely than not have a pro-statehood resident commissioner who's the non-voting member that represents Puerto Rico in the United States Congress. And that means that the probability that we can continue advancing this issue in that next session of Congress and under the next presidential administration at the federal level is really high. So I think that's a pretty good update on what's been going on. And I think it really showcases how the local dynamics in Puerto Rico are, again, continuing to be connected with the federal electoral dynamics for 2024. And with that being said, all of this inevitably impacts what is happening on the island with regards to the local residents, and specifically the challenge that a lot of people feel about whether or not they should, leave the island, which I think is something that we've seen as a huge demographic challenge that Puerto Rico's confronted over the last couple of decades. Some figures that are incredibly important for us to showcase that really talk to the kind of the macro effect of Puerto Rico's territorial status is from the U.S. Census. In 2000, the U.S. Census showed that Puerto Rico's peak population was like 3.8 million.
Yeah, 3.8, close to 3.9, but 3.8.
And then tell us what happened from the peak population of Puerto Rico in 2000 to today.
Well, several different things happened. One, a lot of the federal tax benefits in Puerto Rico kind of had a deadline that they actually ended being implemented in Puerto Rico in around 2006. That led Puerto Rico to have to provide the same services that a state would provide to its citizens, and they incurred a lot of debt, a lot of the bonds. That led to Puerto Rico obviously getting to a point that I believe it was 91 billion in debt in total that they couldn't pay at that point, especially because Puerto Rico, and a lot of people don't know this, Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, back in 1984, they were taking out of the bankruptcy code, Chapter 9. They couldn't claim bankruptcy, none of its municipalities. So Puerto Rico actually initiated its own version of its own bankruptcy code. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, sorry, you're preempted by the bankruptcy code that excludes you. Yep. Which that's why we ended up having in 2016 Promesa pass, so we can have so that basically the federal government could tell the people of Puerto Rico how to resolve their bankruptcy.
But going back to the census, I'm really interested to look at the gap, because I think between 2000 and 2010, there was a drop in population. It went, I think, from 3.8 down to like 3.5.
3.7.
Yeah, 3.7. Right. So that's 200,000
in 2010.
Yeah. So that's a significant amount of population. 200,000 is a lot for an island of less than 4 million. But then what we see is from 2010 to 2020, the population drop was much more significant.
Yep. Mainly a few things happened because, as I mentioned, Promesa and the debt crisis occurred. That led to a lot of austerity measures and a lot of professionals on the island, a lot of young entrepreneurs decided that, oh, wait, I can, for my professional license or for my career, for my business, I can actually do the same work if I just move to Florida, New York, and I get better reimbursement rates, better treatment, and like one thing you said, standard of living overall. So because of those austerity measures and just the debt crisis on the island, a lot of people started moving stateside to Florida, New York, all throughout the country. And then what happened after that was Hurricane Irma and Maria.
Yeah.
And once you saw the differential treatment, and when it comes to not having power, access to clean water, which led to the deaths of thousands of Puerto Ricans, a lot of people decided, I enough is enough. I can't sustain myself here, or let alone have a quality standard of living for myself or my family. So you saw a lot of people leaving Puerto Rico.
One of them was my dad.
Yeah. A lot of them was my family after Maria. Like I have mi abuelita y mi tía that they're right now in close to their hundreds, and they didn't have access to adequate health care, so they had to go to Florida to actually achieve that essential treatment that they needed, because obviously for their healthcare needs. They've gone back to Puerto Rico since then, but a lot of people didn't.
Yeah.
A lot of people decided, just, hey, is this what it means to be a state, to actually have adequate representation, to actually not having to go through multiple hoops just to get the services and benefits that you actually pay into, such as such as Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, SSI. A lot of elderly residents of Puerto Rico, when they came here, they realized, oh my God, I'm actually eligible to receive these benefits, and yeah, it made them realize that it's the benefits of becoming a state.
Yeah, and I think the other big factor was the political crisis that occurred in 2019 when, as a result of a political scandal, our former governor, Ricardo Rosselló, who I worked for in his administration, he faced massive island-wide protests, the so-called Rigi Renuncia movement, and ultimately he ended up leaving office. And then that kind of took all of these different pieces and, made them even more challenging. And the net result of that, the natural disasters, including the hurricanes, but also some earthquakes, the fiscal and debt crisis that Martin mentioned in 2015, 2016, that led to Promesa and the oversight board and the fiscal controls. And then, this political crisis, all of them kind of created this whirlwind situation that led to the population drop between, 2010 and 2020, where we went from, 3.7 down to 3.2.
You hit the nail on the head. Basically, it was a death by 1,000 cuts, because after all the impacts of the storms, the debt crisis, and you mentioned the political turmoil, I remember when I was working on the Hill that it made it created uncertainty, and it actually slowed down the progress of actually getting resources that were already appropriated and allocated to Puerto Rico from actually receiving those funds. So all those issues combined have led to a lot of Puerto Ricans saying, okay, I'm tired of the bureaucratic hurdles that we have to do when I can just go again stateside. But as you were born and raised in Puerto Rico, I was born and raised there, but also raised in Florida. The island still remains with us, whether we leave the island or whether we move stateside or even if we're abroad. We care about the well-being of our people, and that's why you see more and more Puerto Ricans are actually trying to get back to the island.
And I think part of the reason why they feel that it's something that they want is not only because of the sentimental feelings of wanting to be back on the island with its natural beauty, its amazing culture, its fantastic food, amazing beaches, and that sense of community that sometimes you just can't get when you move stateside. But I think the other thing is that as a result of the fiscal crisis and Promesa, we've actually seen some significant improvements in Puerto Rico's debt restructuring. We've seen some significant improvements in Puerto Rico's economic growth outlook as a result of the hurricanes and and the earthquakes, we've also seen significant improvements in terms of federal investment in infrastructure to repair and rebuild. And now Puerto Rico's economy is growing again. And a lot of those folks that are stateside that still have the hope and wish to see things better on the island, they're actually, taking that leap of faith to try to come back and give back. And a lot of those folks, they're coming back with great education, with amazing professional experience, in the hope that they can, rebuild their lives, reconnect with their communities, but also help the island really, unleash its full potential.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the resources and investments in Puerto Rico right now, when it comes to energy, closing the digital divide, are the critical tools that are essential for professionals and entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers to prosper in their careers. Because you really can't have a flourishing business if you don't have access to adequate broadband, have your energy needs met. In this digital world that we live in, having those tools, especially in parts of the island that are more rural, more in the mountains and la montaña, it's harder to get those resources. That's why these recent investments by the federal government, in light of the disasters and other federal funding, is going to be essential for the future prosperity of Puerto Rico and for the future success of Puerto Rico's entrepreneurs.
Definitely. All right, so I think that's a great segue into our main topic and our main guest. Our special guest on today's episode is Angelique Sina, founder and president of Friends of Puerto Rico and executive director of the Metro Women's Business Center. Friends of Puerto Rico is an outstanding organization that focuses on promoting economic development opportunities, particularly for women and youth, through entrepreneurship and education. Angelique Sina has been a powerhouse in the social enterprise and entrepreneurship space on the island, is really tied into the island's innovation ecosystem, and is a perfect example of the El Comeback phenomenon that we're trying to highlight for our audience today, because she was born and raised on the island, came and worked stateside. I had the opportunity to meet Angelique and work with her at the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Federal Affairs Administration. And then after her developing herself as a professional, even working at the World Bank for several years, she decided to come back to the island to give back to the community that she cares about so much. In full disclosure, I've collaborated extensively with Friends of Puerto Rico, not just in the volunteer capacity, but also as a consultant for her organization. So I'm very, very passionate about the work that they do. Please know that the remainder of this episode was recorded remotely, so if there's a change in audio, that's the reason for it. And we look forward to sharing this with you. Angelique, to the Mano a Mano podcast. We're really, really happy to have you on.
Thank you, George. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Definitely, definitely. So, Angelique, the Mano a Mano podcast, this episode, we're titling it The Comeback. And this is an opportunity for us to talk to you as someone who is very much involved in helping support Puerto Rico's process of economic growth and recovery. And we want to hear about the work and amazing work that you do in Friends of Puerto Rico and all the different social enterprises that you're involved with. But before we get into all of that, I would really like to give the audience a little bit of background about who you are, how you came to be, and specifically, why did you decide to leave Puerto Rico and then eventually decide to come back?
I'm Angelique, and I am the president of Friends of Puerto Rico. We are a nonprofit, and we create economic opportunity for the people of Puerto Rico. I'm originally from this beautiful, sunny town of Aguadilla in Puerto Rico, and I went to school there. I left the island when I was 21 because really I was in a way forced to leave. There were a lot of things occurring in Puerto Rico, and there were limited job opportunities for me. So I came to Washington to be an intern, where I had the opportunity to work with you. That seems like a very long time ago, but it really was not. And I had the opportunity to just learn about public service, which is something that I think a lot of young people on the island wish that they would have a career in service in the government. And I had the opportunity to kick off my career with that. And that has led to me being able to work on Capitol Hill, working with the governor's office in Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., learn so many things, and then also then just champion my career to work from an international perspective at the World Bank Group, which is something totally different. But that was in a full circle. I think I've managed to have a background in business, learn a little bit about public service, although my tenure was very short, and then champion to uniting both and saying we need to work from that third sector to really help Puerto Rico be at its best. And now at this stage, I'm living in Puerto Rico, and I'm now into one of many things, including farming, which I hope we can get to talk about. But I wanted to say just in full circle how it started, and then things that occurred, and then why I'm now returning to the island.
I really appreciate that. And I mentioned in the introduction that I've known you for some time. I originally met you as an intern in the Washington, D.C. office of the governor of Puerto Rico back in, I think it was 2010. Then we worked together again briefly when we were in Congress in the office of the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, which is obviously Puerto Rico's non-voting member in the U.S. House of Representatives. And from there, I saw you kind of take off and do amazing things, work at the World Bank, but then something happened somewhere along the way after several years of you being at the World Bank where you really felt compelled to find a way to give back to Puerto Rico. And that's when I began hearing about Friends of Puerto Rico, which is the organization that you founded and that you're the president of. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that organization, kind of what brought that about?
Absolutely. So Friends of Puerto Rico was actually born while I worked at the World Bank because I had this very strong desire to serve my island and to find a way to pay it forward. I wanted to pay it forward because the island itself had given me so much. And while I was working for this powerful institution like the World Bank Group, which has so much power in so many ways, like establishing its own currency, eliminating poverty in most countries, yet it couldn't do anything for Puerto Rico. I thought it was a good way for me with a group of friends to contribute towards the island in a very positive way. We didn't want to tie it to anything that had to be political. We really just wanted to serve students and young people in different causes on the island. And that was really the birth of it. It was just an idea of us coming together through something powerful that united, which was this mad love for Puerto Rico, and do something positive. And I'm a believer that when you put enough passion and work into it, people will listen and follow. And fast forward, we are next year turning 10 years old.
That's amazing. And just to clarify for our audience, as a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico is considered a domestic jurisdiction for federal purposes, which means that we don't have any representation in international organizations, including the World Bank. So we don't have participation in that institution or in any other international institution of that nature. In a sense, as a territory, we get the worst of both worlds. We don't have full participation in the federal government. We don't have a representation in the House that's, proportional. We don't have any representation in the Senate. We can't vote for president. And on the international side, we're domestic jurisdiction of the United States, and we basically can't participate there either. And this is really kind of emblematic of the challenge of being a territory where you're not fully part of the United States, but then you don't have the freedom and the sovereignty to be able to participate in international institutions. And I think that's why I also find it so courageous that you decided to take action into your own hands along with other friends to establish a nonprofit organization, Friends of Puerto Rico, to begin doing that work and to basically leverage the connections and the relationships that you've been building with so many amazing people here in Washington, D.C. And elsewhere in the States that care deeply about Puerto Rico. And I want to ask, of the people who helped establish that organization with you, were some of them other Puerto Ricans that had moved stateside, or were many of them other Americans that cared about Puerto Rico that didn't necessarily have a relationship with the island?
Yeah, so it was a combination of both. It was people that were diaspora like me, and then others that just cared about the island because they had either visited or they had a business there. But I think the fact of our current status is what led to the creation of Friends of Puerto Rico, right? It was to kind of we found that gap of things that we could contribute and mark a difference, because there's really limited things that the government can do. And then from an international organization perspective, we really couldn't do anything. So that's why we decided to create the organization.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in Friends of Puerto Rico, particularly around economic development and entrepreneurship? In the podcast so far, we focused a lot on some of the constitutional issues with the island. We've talked some about what's happening in Congress and the legislation, but we haven't yet really talked about kind of the lived experience of folks on the island in terms of the opportunities that are there and how territory status is challenging and limiting those opportunities. And then what's the work that organizations like yours are doing to find a way to help support economic growth that is kind of locally led?
I love that question. And it really brings me back to our mission. Our mission is simple because it's creating economic opportunity, yet it is so relevant and it's not so easy to do. And when I say about creating economic opportunity, people are like, what does that mean? And I say in very simple words, it's working with the underserved. It's working with youth that are on the island. It's working with a lot of times women that they have a dream or they want to accomplish something. And a lot of times they don't know where to go. And that's where we come in. To give you an example, we have a beautiful youth entrepreneurship program called Seeds, where we teach kids starting from the age of 9 how to think like an entrepreneur, how to act like an entrepreneur, and how to make their own money so that they can be self-sufficient. And on top of that, we teach them agriculture, which is a very important thing on the island that we need to continue supporting is a local food growth. And we also work with youth to preparing them to go to college, which we do that now through Unidos US, which is one of our partners, along with investing with women that want to start businesses. We're very lucky to have a women's business center in Old San Juan. We've done that in partnership with the Small Business Administration, and that's a federal government grant, along with creating the first economic development center in the northwest of the island, which is huge because we need to think of equity around the island. San Juan has 1 million people living there, but we also need to think of the rest of the island. What is really happening in places like Aguadilla, Moca, Isabela, that have a lot of interest in terms of real estate, but how can we really build that equity? And we're doing that by investing in our people so that they can have the skills that they need to contribute towards the economy.
I think that that's really important. And not just developing the skills to be workers, but also the means for individuals to actually build their own businesses so they can become employers and then eventually break cycles of poverty and achieve sustainable economic growth that is locally rooted and not dependent on some of the models that unfortunately have led to Puerto Rico's economic fragility, which include a lot of the tax incentive based industrialization, where when Congress decides to extend that incentive, it works for a while. But if Congress at any point decides to change it, because as a territory they can, then things crumble and job opportunities go. And I think that's really one of the things that I find most compelling about the work that you're doing in Friends of Puerto Rico. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and how the work that you're doing is connecting with kind of a broader ecosystem of innovation and entrepreneurship that you see growing on the island.
Yeah, so entrepreneurship is key. We need to strengthen our ecosystem. The more competitive we are, the bigger of a chance we have to continue bringing in resources to the island and keep the people in our archipelago, actually, because we are a set of islands, to remain as a healthy community and a strong ecosystem. So we believe that when we invest in youth starting from age 9 up, right, because we want to take them all the way until high school, hopefully get them a higher degree or the skills that they need to have a high paying job and or later on start a business, are key factors for a sustainable economic development. If we don't have small businesses on the island, we will remain not competitive, right? So our jobs and all of our resources and all of the factories that we've had will be going farther and farther away when we need to think of nearshoring. We need to be available, right, to do business with the United States to really help build that sustainability. So the work that we're doing is across the island. We also have an office in Washington, D.C., where one thing that we do is that we give exposure to local entrepreneurs that participate in our programs with our events. That's a combination of like, okay, you might be a great business owner or run a very successful company on the island. Guess what? That market share will be short for you. You need to think of how can you export your services? How can you find other people to do business with? And that's where we come in. And that's where our name is very on point because we are the Friends of Puerto Rico. And yes, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans, but there's also a lot of people that are not Puerto Rican that just love the island and are looking to do business, or just they love our food, they love our culture, they love our music. And through our events, we do matchmaking, we do networking, and also we have our event on Capitol Hill where people also can attend and learn and interact with members of Congress. And a lot of time is just educating them about what our culture is like and what our needs are like.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important work. And I know last year you had the Economic Empowerment Summit that you held in Congress, which had multiple members of Congress attend as the first time that your organization threw such an event. But I thought it was incredibly powerful opportunity to continue raising awareness in Congress about the need to support Puerto Rico's economic development, but ultimately one of the challenges that I would like to kind of get your feedback on is in the Mano a Mano show, we're trying to raise awareness about the ways in which territorial inequality limits Puerto Rico's economic development potential and capacity. And that's why we believe so passionately that Congress needs to provide an opportunity for Puerto Rico to resolve its territory status. Can you tell us some of the ways that you've seen in your work with Friends of Puerto Rico where, territorial inequality is challenging the populations that you work with and, driving people to have to make this choice of, do I stay in a not so good situation or do I leave?
Yeah, so that is a very complex question. But I will start by saying that because we serve the community of aspiring business owners or business owners, there is a large discrepancy when it comes to access to capital, given the limitations that we have in the banking industry on the island, the limited number of banks that we have. So that is something that is huge. It's extremely inequitable to start or grow a business and try to get the capital that you should be eligible to at least compete for or be evaluated in a certain way. I would say that's number one. Number two also is there's a big digital divide in many ways, right? In terms of like broadband, is it across the island? Is it equitable? And then also from an energy perspective, I think that those are three key issues that really affect your day to day. Imagine just trying to do something and not having the proper broadband or Wi-Fi that we have on the mainland that affects in different ways, and also from an energy perspective. I think those three things, we see it on a day-to-day, how that affects the community that we serve, and also a lot of times limits us from being as competitive in comparison to the United States mainland.
And I think those are incredibly powerful observations. And one of the things that I'll say is that a lot of people may listen to this and think, well, how are those related to territorial inequality and Puerto Rico's political status? And I think here's where it's an opportunity for me to bring in some of my experience having worked in government and having seen some of these issues raised over decades. And the reality is that Puerto Rico as a territory has been treated unequally in a number of ways for decades. And that territorial inequality under federal laws and programs means that there is a lower volume of capital that is circulating in the economy in Puerto Rico. That means that there's a reduced amount of money that's circulating into the banks and into businesses, and therefore there's less money for banks and businesses to lend and to invest. So literally we've reduced the capital flow to the jurisdiction because of its territory status versus the amount of capital that it would automatically have as a state, because as a state it would achieve equal treatment under all federal programs, and that would increase the amount of federal investment. And that would not only impact impact the access to capital, but it would also impact infrastructure investments like broadband. For example, in the most recent Infrastructure and Jobs Act legislation, there was a huge amount of money allocated towards reducing the digital divide in Puerto Rico and other places. But, those are federal dollars that are not guaranteed to Puerto Rico as a territory. Every time that federal law is passed, Congress needs to write specific language to make sure that Puerto Rico and the other territories are included. And unfortunately, sometimes that kind of support is not always forthcoming. Thankfully, it was in this last time, but in the past, it hasn't been on occasion. And part of that kind of cumulative underinvestment, the result of it is that fragility in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of broadband, and in terms of energy. And those are fundamental to be able to build businesses. You can have the best ideas as an entrepreneur. You can have the best skilled individuals. But if you don't have those basics, capital, energy, and nowadays broadband, you're kind of out of luck.
I agree. And George, I chose those three because those are the major ones. And quite honestly, as you know me, maybe the least controversial. But I think every single thing because coming back, yes, I had the blessing of being born in this beautiful place in Puerto Rico, had the privilege of living in a high power city like Washington, D.C., and in a way conquered it in so many ways because I squeezed every second, every day I was here. I don't think I can do anything more. And then coming back to live in Puerto Rico in an extremely rural area, I will say that every single day and every single thing that I do is unequitable. Everything.
Wow.
But I can't, it would be a 10-hour podcast and it wouldn't be enough time. But it is very, very frustrating to move now back and say, oh my gosh, if I would be 10,000 miles or just in a different location, it wouldn't be like this. But at the same time, because I'm a very positive person, I say this is what makes us so resilient and so innovative and so creative because the system is so frustrating that you just find a way to make it work.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of different phrases that capture that. One of them is la brega, let's figure out how to make it happen. Vamos a bregar con esto. So I think that is kind of a perfect segue to ask you some questions about how you're seeing the post-disaster recovery and the recovery now that the Fiscal Oversight Board has been in place for several years and we have the debt restructuring process kind of moving forward and Puerto Rico's economy has finally given some signs that it's actually beginning to restore growth. How do you see that from the ground up in terms of the work that you do with the communities that you serve?
I feel like we have seen some progress, especially in the last 2 years. I know that we had the pandemic on top of that and we had earthquakes. So there's always, unfortunately, something happening on the island that is not so positive. Yet I do see that if we talk about the recovery work from Maria, I do see that there has been progress. We ourselves, Friends of Puerto Rico, we have been recipients of federal grants from the disaster recovery. So that's been super positive for us to see kind of how was that timeline, how was that process, so that we can share with others, other organizations, other individuals that would need these access to these funds. And we have seen some progress. There's still a lot of work to be done that comes from the root level. Hurricane Maria did do a lot of positive public relations work that, yes, Puerto Rico exists. Yes, oh my gosh, we've had for years these energy problems. So it's very positive that now there are issues that we are talking about from a federal level, that at a local level, people are more open of thinking about solar that they probably weren't before the hurricane. But there is still so much work to be done. In our case, we feel super fortunate to be working with a lot of people that are championing ideas. And honestly, a lot of changes have occurred from a lot of companies that were on the island. Some have left, some have come, and people need to find a way to find a living. And when it comes to women that are on the island, a lot of them, they need to find a way to provide for their families because they can't do a full 9-to-5 job. So entrepreneurship is a way that they have found to make ends meet. And so I do see progress. I do see a lot of people just taking more risks than probably wouldn't have happened before Hurricane Maria. And I see that as a very positive way for us to work together and also try to bring that sustainability lens that the island needs, because we cannot be an island that only receives federal funds and the majority of our population is on federal aid. I don't think that's a scenario that anyone would want because it's not sustainable. We need to find a way for us to really look at what are our resources and what are we going to create with that.
Yeah, no, and I think what you're talking about is exactly on point. And I know you and I have had this conversation before, but kind of for the benefit of our listeners, Puerto Rico really needs a game changer. Part of having something that really kind of vastly increases the opportunity for everyone on the island is having a clear direction about where the jurisdiction's future is going to go. Under territory status, we continue having a circumstance where for some things we're treated equally under federal law, for some things we're treated unequally. Sometimes when the local legislature or the governor and the executive, they pass policies, they're policies that, work under territory status, but wouldn't work if Puerto Rico chose statehood or wouldn't work if Puerto Rico chose independence. So there's that kind of variability and lack of clear, consistent direction for a policy framework that can actually help to support a robust economy where Puerto Rico can identify what its core competitive advantages are and then develop a consistent plan to support education that helps grow a workforce that can meet that, supports entrepreneurship that can increase the capacity for businesses to actually be developed locally, that can produce and export and do all the things that they need to do, and then also set government policies that really are consistent with helping the market grow. So what would be your feedback and thoughts on those perspectives?
I agree with them. I think that we need to look at the framework of the things that we're good at, the resources that we have, and find a way for all of us to contribute equally. There's also one aspect, right, that Puerto Rico is it's an island. I think it's number 7 when it comes to being, we were a country, the country that has the most aging population, right? So how are we going to attend them, and how will the current status that we have be able to support them? I understand that while I'm not an expert, that there is policy that is, and a lot of times Puerto Rico is not included when it comes from everything that has to do with healthcare. How will we probably serve that population? Those are questions that I ask myself so that we can be competitive, so that we can really have the best in our island, because our island is absolutely beautiful. Puerto Rico is stunning. It's a beautiful place. The people are extraordinary. How can we live up, right, in terms of our economy to all of what the island has to offer? Those are, and how do we get those answers?
Yeah. Well, my personal belief is that one of the ways in which we get those answers is for Congress to take full responsibility for holding Puerto Rico as a territory and provide the U.S. citizens there a definitive choice. You either, can choose to have full equality and democracy through statehood, or you can choose independence, whether that's complete independence or free association. But at least there, everyone knows what direction to develop the policy so that we can develop an economic plan that's kind of coherent with that. And that is something that is not just important from the policy perspective, but I think it's also fundamentally important from the population perspective. One of the things that we talked about in the intro before you came on was about the decrease in Puerto Rico's population from 2000 to today and how devastating that has been. And that's something that is devastating on a human level because it tears apart communities, it tears apart families, and people have to leave places where they have the people that they cherish the most and that they grew up around. And I know this is something that's a lived experience for me and obviously for you as well. But there's another part of this, which is that as Puerto Rico's population decreases, you also lose your labor force. You lose your consumer demand. You lose your tax base. So it makes it harder and harder to grow the economy and to sustain the economy. And that game changer that I think would result from a definitive choice on Puerto Rico's status is something that I think could address one of the issues that you brought about, which is the growth in our elderly population. We need more young people on the island. And in order to, get more young people on the island, we need to improve quality of living so that the families that are here will stay, and also so that folks like you and me that moved stateside but still love the island dearly with all of our hearts can bring back our passion, the skills and the knowledge that we've developed, all of these amazing connections with all of these friends that we can choose to do entrepreneurial activities with, or philanthropic activities or business with, and then basically kind of come back to the island and bring that. So I just wanted to share that and kind of get your take on what you think and how you see that from your experience in your lens.
So, George, I think you actually said it. It's about improving the quality of life and identifying those resources that will create that economic opportunity. And you have a family, right? So for you, it might be different, right? But we want to be in a place that you could, it doesn't matter what you do, or well, not all careers will apply, but most careers for the diaspora to be able to return to the island no matter what, right? Anyway, you're a plane ride away. Me going from Washington, D.C. to New York is a 4-hour drive. It's actually the same commute, well, similar, a little bit longer, but it's a 4-hour flight for me to go from San Juan to Washington, D.C. How do we create that? And I think that's where people like you, with the work that you are doing from a policy level, our organization, Friends of Puerto Rico, does in a day-to-day, creating those economic opportunities, academia, government, bringing all of that together, I think is a good way to start, because we all know it's not going to be easy. I think many of us have been trying to work on this in different ways throughout the years, but we have to go back to basics and see how would this work? How could we get more people back on the island? Because otherwise, who will be left there? And if Congress doesn't pay close attention to this, guess what? It's going to be their problem, because all the members of Congress are going to have more and more people from Puerto Rico in their districts, and they're going to have to pay attention sooner rather than later.
Definitely, definitely. So can you tell us just a little bit, having been now back on the island for a few years, what you've seen in terms of other people in our generation deciding to return? Like, what is motivating them? What do they feel hopeful about? What are some of the frustrations that they're encountering when they get back? We're interested in knowing, what does the comeback look like?
The comeback is very passionate, right? Because we're always thinking, oh my gosh, like when you think of your mother's home or your grandmother's home, and it's like this great food always waiting for you and hugs and family, it's home, right? It feels like home. And I think it's a very passionate journey when you start thinking, oh my gosh, will I move back? Will I not move back? If you care what people think, what will people think? It's a process just like that. But it is home at the end of the day. It wasn't easy for me to leave my comfort of Puerto Rico and come to a city like DC very young, that I had to learn how to use the metro, right? And things like that, like I was not used to. And it'll be the same process going back home, but there are a lot of attributes, I would say. One, you come back differently, and instead, like I remember my family would complain about problems about, oh my gosh, it's so hot. And I'm thinking, yes, it's global warming. We should be doing something about that. I don't care if it's hot, right? Because I missed the heat while I was away. So I think I personally, I look at a lot of the problems as opportunities. And that's something that I have championed, because I have returned. And yes, I lead Friends of Puerto Rico, but I've also started 2 different ventures, right? So because I see these problems that our community in Puerto Rico have seen as problems for decades, and I see them as opportunities. And I think that's the biggest asset. Also, I think that we are trained differently when you work abroad. So I think that's also an asset that we bring to try to inspire other people on the island. Well, let's not work maybe so hard. Let's work smart, right? There's things that we've learned working in different places that we can definitely bring. And also an improved language. Our English is automatically improved because we've lived abroad. So, or we've lived overseas, or we've lived in another state. So I think those are just some of the many attributes. And quite honestly, George, which I hope a lot of people from the diaspora or just, people that are thinking of living or going back to Puerto Rico, is the weather in Puerto Rico is awesome. Like seeing the sun and seeing the ocean, and I'm sorry, I lakes are beautiful and rivers are nice. And yes, I get it. New York has beaches and Miami has beaches, but there's really nothing like that in comparison to Puerto Rico. And Culebra and Vieques and these places are fabulous. I could tell you that I've been to these very far away exotic locations where I have to be a day and a half traveling, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I should have just gone to Vieques or Culebra. It's so beautiful. And those are just some, in a very superficial way, some of the many attributes that I think returning can bring, besides the fact that you have, in a way, a lower cost of living, and you could probably save more for your retirement while being back on the island.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I'll confess something here on the podcast with you. My wife and I have talked on multiple times about the possibility of us moving our whole family back to Puerto Rico. And my wife's a federal employee. I work thankfully in a flexible way, so I could make it work. But one of the big concerns is the opportunities for my kids and also healthcare. And I think that if we do have a change in status and then there's at least a clear direction of where Puerto Rico's future is going, there's been a lot more people that will feel the comfort and willingness to come back. So that's what I believe. Do you think that a change in status would inspire more people to feel committed to come back to the island?
I will accept anything to get more people back to Puerto Rico. Honestly. And I will say something, George. I have seen a huge change in schools in Puerto Rico. I would go to public or private, and people would be speaking to me in Spanish. Now I go to any school, and kids are talking to me in English. Why? Because a lot of people, a lot of mainland Americans have moved to Puerto Rico, and maybe if the change of status would motivate more people to go, I'm all in for it, because we do need young people. We need a productive economy, and we need an island full of people. We can't have an empty island.
Do you think that if Congress doesn't take action and we continue under the territory status, even with all the federal funds that are going into the island now, even with the debt restructure process nearing conclusion, do you think Puerto Rico would ever be able to really reach its full potential?
Because Congress does have so much power over Puerto Rico, then I think it limits us the way that we are right now. I wish, and I know so many people have worked for so many more years than I have in the issue. I really hope that there is an equitable opportunity and a solution. I also think that on the island, there's a lot of people that they don't understand the complexities of the current territorial status and the possibilities of moving, from one way or the other. And I hope that when that moment comes, that the people are actually, that they're able to make the best decision if it is up to them. And the same thing for Congress to be able to do that, which is why I am a believer that we need to talk to people. We need to educate them. They need to visit the island, and we need to educate them in a different way. And a lot of times it's not telling them, let's talk about status. It's like, let's listen to some music.
Yeah.
Let's listen to some traditional beats. Let's try our delicious rum.
Yeah.
Or let's just,
Come eat some
talk about
tostones
something
and
else.
rice and beans and delicious roast pork.
Exactly.
Yeah. Lechon.
And people will listen and they'll understand, because we are a very complex place.
Yeah.
We are amazing people, but it's very hard for a lot of members of Congress to understand what we are and what we can achieve.
Yeah, no, I agree with you fully. And I think one of the good signs and positive signs of progress overall is that ever since Hurricanes Irma and Maria happened in 2017, we have seen a huge increase in the amount of visits by members of Congress, by cabinet officials. We were just mentioning earlier that this past weekend there was both House and Senate Democrats and then some, House Republicans that came. So it's not something that's exclusive to one party or the other. We've got the vice president coming to Puerto Rico in the coming days. So it really does show that there is an increased attention and awareness about the importance of the island, but also opportunities for folks that are decision makers stateside to get that direct experience, to hear directly from people on the ground, including people like you that are doing amazing work to help support our women and our youth to develop themselves into their maximum potential and to build that future that Puerto Rico is going to need, no matter what eventually happens with the issue of resolving Puerto Rico's territory status.
Yes, and I know, George, that that's a lot of all of this and occurs in many ways because of the work that you've been doing. That since I've met you, you've been championing, and that's just it's great to see also the fruits of your labor. I know your work is not easy. It is yet very important. So it's really good to have seen this shift in the last few years since from Hurricane Maria to now to see a special interest on the island.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, the work that you're doing is incredibly important also because you're also participating in organizations like Invest Puerto Rico, which is seeking to bring additional investment to the island, but also the participation that you're having in all the different forums and hubs for young entrepreneur and innovators in Puerto Rico's local economy, because whenever Puerto Rico actually decides its future and Congress provides that opportunity, and even until then, we're going to need all of that talent, all of that ingenuity, all of that innovation to drive the growth of businesses and the private sector and the nonprofit sector and academia and government all working together to build a new society that is significantly more stable politically, economically, and also socially just. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. And I would love to ask you if our listeners would like to learn more about your work and the work of Friends of Puerto Rico, where can they go to learn more?
You can visit our website at friendsofpuertorico.org and also on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We would love to connect with you, whether if you're on the mainland or if you plan to be in Puerto Rico. Feel free to reach out to us.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Angelique. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you for the work that you're doing to support the future of Puerto Rico in so many ways and improve the present as we build that future together.
Thank you, George.